Welcome to the Explainer. Okay, let's dive into this. We are looking at what is arguably the most explosive, just completely unbelievable 7-year arc in human history. We're going to trace Napoleon Bonaparte's astonishing rise to absolute power, and then his equally devastating fall. It's a story of unmatched military genius, sure, but it's also a stark warning about strategic overextension and profound hubris. To really grasp the sheer, terrifying scale of Napoleon's power at his peak, you don't need to look any further than this quote. Back in December 1805, Napoleon pulled off a crushing victory over the combined Austro-Russian forces at Austerlitz. And when British Prime Minister William Pitt got the news, he recognized the staggering stakes immediately and uttered this famous warning. He knew, right then and there, that the entire balance of power in Europe had been shattered. Which brings us to the central question we're tackling today. How exactly does a military genius conquer a continent only to completely engineer his own spectacular downfall? Today, we're unpacking this to find the universal leadership lessons here. We want to figure out what happens when our ambition completely outpaces our reality, and when unyielding hubris takes over the wheel. So to start, we really have to understand the fundamental geopolitical stalemate of the era. Think of it essentially as a battle between a whale and an elephant. On one side, you have Britain. They were the absolute master of the sea, an advantage permanently locked in by Admiral Nelson's complete triumph at Trafalgar. On the other side, France, under Napoleon, was completely unbeatable on land. It was a massive deadlock. Neither of them could directly challenge the other in their own domain. Now, Napoleon's early dominance on land wasn't just about his personal brilliance. It was fundamentally structural. He used something called the corps system. Think of each corps as a mini army of about 15,000 to 30,000 soldiers, complete with its own infantry, cavalry, and artillery. This was a revolutionary, incredibly modern military concept at the time. It allowed his forces to disperse across multiple roads, move with literally unbelievable speed, and live off the land, instead of being dragged down by slow supply wagons. When they finally found the enemy, they could concentrate rapidly, surprising and trapping commanders, like General Mack at Ulm, before they even realized the danger. Let's move to see how this builds. This structural advantage sparked an absolute blitzkrieg of victories. Just map out this timeline in your head. From crushing General Mack at Ulm and winning at Austerlitz in 1805, to completely devastating the fearsome Prussian army at Jena-Auerstadt in 1806, and then securing a massive, decisive win against the Russians at Friedland in 1807. This relentless, almost robotic streak of triumphs forced the treaties of Tilsit, which left Napoleon as the undisputed master of Europe. Section 1. The Continental System and the Hubris of Overreach. Because Napoleon couldn't defeat the British whale at sea, he decided to pivot. He attempted to bankrupt them through a massive, practically impossible economic blockade known as the Continental System. And to enforce it, he made a fatal error. He forced his own brother onto the Spanish throne. This instantly sparked a furious uprising and gave birth to a very modern military concept in the Iberian Peninsula, La Guerilla, or the Little War. Spanish and Portuguese civilians and militias began waging this merciless, asymmetric hit-and-run insurgency against French occupiers. It was a desperate battle for hearts and minds, filled with brutal atrocities on both sides. The French found themselves trapped in an impossible lose-lose nightmare in Spain. If they dispersed their forces to try and fight off the guerrillas, they'd fall victim to General Wellington's highly disciplined regular British army, which included incredibly deadly units like the 95th Rifles. But if the French decided to concentrate their forces to fight Wellington in a traditional pitched battle, they instantly lost all control of the countryside to ruthless local partisan ambushes. The sheer scale of this mistake is horrifying, and it serves as a stark reminder of the sunk cost fallacy, doubling down on a terrible strategic bet. Napoleon himself called it his bleeding ulcer. For years, this conflict cost the French Empire an average of 100 casualties every single day. Ultimately, this unending insurgency bled away 260,000 French lives. Just a staggering loss. Section 2. The Meat Grinders and the Turning of the Tide. While Spain was continuously bleeding the French out west, enemies in the wider European theater began learning from Napoleon and adopting his own tactics. Over in Austria, Archduke Charles modernized his infantry and actually adopted the corps system. So the era of easy, fast victories, that was officially over. Look at the staggering human cost at the Battle of Wagram in 1809, an estimated 37,500 French casualties. And shortly before that at Aspern-Essling, Napoleon suffered his first major defeat and lost his brilliant commander and incredibly close friend, Marshal Lannes. These were turning into brutal slugfests. And this brilliantly illustrates a really important concept. The long-term impact of these meat grinder campaigns was completely devastating. It's a classic case of organizational burnout. You can only run your absolute top performers at maximum capacity for so long before they inevitably break. Even in victory, the exhaustion of his veteran troops meant the once invincible Grande Armée was rapidly losing its edge. Napoleon was increasingly forced to rely on inexperienced young conscripts just to fill the massive gaps left by his seasoned veterans falling in battle. Section 3. The Russian Gambled. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the sheer unprecedented scale of what happens next. Tsar Alexander of Russia decided to flout the economically disastrous continental system and resume trade with Britain. Napoleon was infuriated and decided to punish Russia. It was his ultimate empire-ending gamble. To do it, he assembled the largest army Europe had ever seen, roughly 600,000 men. It was a massive multinational invasion force pushing toward the border. The Russians, heavily outnumbered on their own soil, could initially field just 220,000 defenders. But the Russians, under General Barclay de Tolly, employed a brilliantly frustrating defensive strategy. It was a three-part masterclass. First, they retreated, strictly refusing to give Napoleon the quick, decisive battle he desperately needed. Second, they enacted a ruthless, scorched earth policy, literally destroying their own crops and villages to deny the French any supplies whatsoever. Third, they unleashed their Cossack cavalry to conduct relentless hit-and-run raids, constantly tearing at the stretched French supply lines. The logistical nightmare was instantaneous. It turns out the greatest enemy of the world's most feared army wasn't a master tactician, it was summer mud and starvation. The lumbering Grande Armée was totally crippled, losing a staggering 1,000 horses every single day. This catastrophic loss of horsepower destroyed their transport wagons and completely blinded their cavalry reconnaissance capabilities. They were marching in the dark. It's a brutal lesson in overextension, proving that logistics dictate reality, no matter how grand your vision is. Pushing 250 miles deep into impoverished Russian territory, the human cost was just tragic. Without fighting a single major battle, the massive French army lost 20% of its strength. Young conscripts simply could not survive the grueling marches and the devastating outbreaks of typhus and dysentery. From here, the campaign rapidly accelerated toward a deadly climax. The French scored a completely empty victory at the burning, devastated city of Smolensk, but refusing to stop and winter there, Napoleon gambled everything on a massive, rapid push toward Moscow. The clock was ticking. Meanwhile, the newly appointed General Kutuzov took command of the Russian forces. Realizing they couldn't just give up Moscow without a fight, the Russian army finally turned, entrenched themselves, and prepared to make their ultimate stand at the village of Borodino, just 70 miles from the capital. So the crucial point is, we leave Napoleon here, gazing at the massive Russian army at the gates of Borodino. His army is completely exhausted, decimated by disease, and terrifyingly far from home. It leaves us with one final thought to ponder. When a leader genuinely believes they are invincible, what is the true catastrophic cost of their ultimate gamble?